The summer sun burned hot over the dry lands of the Southwest as Daniel Blackhawk rode with his Apache brothers through the rocky canyon, his dark eyes watching every shadow and movement around them. With the skill of a man who had lived by his wits and strength for 23 years now. And behind him rode 7 more warriors, all of them silent as ghosts as they tracked the Comanche hunting party that had crossed into what the Apache considered their territory. Though in truth these lands belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold them, and the hatred between Apache and Comanche ran deeper than the oldest rivers, fed by generations of raids and counter-raids, stolen horses and spilled blood, a cycle that seemed to have no end and no beginning, just an eternal present of anger and revenge. Daniel's uncle had died just 1 winter ago, killed by Comanche arrows during a hunt that had gone wrong, and the memory of finding his body still burned in Daniel's chest like hot coals, though he tried to keep his face calm and his mind clear, because a warrior who let emotion cloud his judgment was a dead warrior, and his people needed him alive and sharp. So he focused on the trail ahead, reading the signs in the dust and broken brush that told him they were getting close to the Comanche camp. Maybe an hour's ride at most, and he raised his hand to signal his men to slow down and spread out, preparing for what would come next. They crested a hill, and there below them sat the Comanche camp, maybe 15 warriors and their families, with smoke rising from cooking fires and horses grazing nearby in a makeshift corral. And Daniel counted the men and calculated the odds, knowing that 8 against 15 was not good, but also knowing that surprise would give them the advantage they needed, at least long enough to take some horses and supplies before retreating back into the canyons, where the Comanche would be foolish to follow. And he was about to give the signal to attack when movement near one of the hide lodges caught his eye and made his breath stop in his throat. A young woman stepped out into the sunlight, carrying a clay water vessel on her hip. And even from this distance, Daniel could see that she moved with a grace that seemed almost like dancing, her long black hair falling down her back like a waterfall of pure night, and she wore a deerskin dress decorated with beadwork that caught the light as she walked toward the stream that ran past the camp, completely unaware that death watched her from the hills above. And for reasons Daniel could not explain or understand, his heart began to beat in a different rhythm, faster but also softer, as if something inside him recognized something in her that went beyond tribe and tradition and all the old hatreds. He shook his head hard, trying to clear away these strange thoughts, reminding himself that she was Comanche and therefore enemy, that his duty was to his people and to the memory of his dead uncle, but his eyes kept finding her among the chaos of the camp below, tracking her movements as she knelt by the stream to fill her vessel, the sun making her wet hands sparkle like they were covered in diamonds. And he felt something shift inside him that he had never felt before, something that scared him more than any warrior's challenge ever had. Daniel raised his hand and gave the attack signal, and his warriors let out their war cries as they charged down the hill into the Comanche camp, and everything became noise and movement and dust, warriors grabbing weapons and women screaming and horses rearing in panic, and Daniel fought with his usual skill, his knife in his hands moving without thought because his body had been trained since childhood to react and survive. But part of his mind stayed always aware of where that girl was, making sure that the fighting did not flow in her direction, protecting her without even meaning to, which was madness but also somehow felt more real than anything else happening around him. An older Comanche warrior came at him with a spear, and they fought hard, circling and striking and blocking. And Daniel recognized the older man's face marked with the scars of many battles. And he knew this was a chief or someone important. And when the man stumbled on a rock and went down on one knee, Daniel had a clear shot to finish him, to drive his knife home and add another death to the long count between their peoples. But in that exact moment, the girl appeared beside them, her eyes wide with fear but also with something fierce and unbreakable, and their eyes met across the space of maybe 10 feet. And something passed between them that had no words and no name. Just a recognition that went soul deep. Daniel lowered his knife just a little, just enough, and the older warrior used that moment to roll away and retreat toward the other Comanche defenders. And the girl stood frozen, staring at Daniel with an expression he could not read, surprise and confusion and maybe something like wonder, and he wanted to say something to her, to explain why he had spared the older warrior, but there was no time and no shared language, and his brothers were already pulling back, having taken several horses and some supplies, considering the raid successful enough. As they rode away from the Comanche camp, Daniel looked back one last time and saw her standing there in the dust and smoke, her hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun, watching them go. And he knew with absolute certainty that something had changed in him during those few seconds when their eyes had met, something that could not be unchanged. And beside him, his friend Carlos Running Bear said something about the raid going well. But Daniel barely heard him because his mind was still back in that camp, still seeing those dark eyes that had looked at him not with pure hate, but with something more complicated and human. That night, the Apache warriors celebrated around their fire, passing around food and telling stories of the raid, and Daniel sat a little apart from them, staring into the flames and seeing her face in every flicker and shadow. And he did not yet know her name was Maya Redfeather, did not know that she was the daughter of the warrior he had spared, did not know that she was lying awake in her own camp thinking about him too, wondering about the Apache warrior who had shown mercy when he could have chosen killing. But he knew that his life had just become more complicated in ways he could not yet understand, and that the hatred he had been taught to feel toward all Comanche had developed a crack. And through that crack was pouring something new and dangerous and utterly unstoppable. 3 weeks passed like 3 years for Daniel Blackhawk, each day dragging by with the weight of something unfinished and unresolved, and he could not stop thinking about the Comanche girl with the waterfall hair and eyes that had looked at him with understanding instead of hatred, and his nights were filled with dreams of her that left him restless and confused when he woke. And during the day he volunteered for every scouting mission and hunting party that might take him near the border territories where Apache and Comanche lands met and blurred, hoping for just one more glimpse of her, which he knew was foolish and dangerous but could not seem to help. The Apache had moved their summer camp closer to the river that marked the unclear boundary between the two tribes' territories, a place where both peoples came to hunt and fish, but neither felt completely safe. And Daniel found himself walking to the river's edge every evening as the sun went down, ostensibly to check for signs of Comanche scouts, but really just standing there in the fading light, remembering that moment when their eyes had met, and the world had seemed to shift on its foundation, and his friend Carlos noticed his strange behavior, but said nothing at first, though his eyes held questions that Daniel was not ready to answer. Maya Redfeather was suffering her own private torment in the Comanche camp, unable to forget the face of the young Apache warrior who had spared her father Joseph's life during the raid, and she had replayed that moment in her mind 1,000 times, trying to understand what she had seen in his eyes, trying to make sense of the mercy he had shown when everything she had been taught said that Apache warriors knew only cruelty and violence. And her best friend, Sophie Brightwater, had noticed that Maya seemed distant and distracted, her hands fumbling at tasks she normally performed with ease, her mind clearly somewhere far away. One evening as they gathered roots near the river, Sophie finally asked what was wrong, and Maya hesitated because speaking the truth out loud would make it real in a way that keeping it inside did not. But she trusted Sophie and needed to tell someone, so she explained about the raid and the warrior, and the strange moment of connection that had passed between them, and Sophie's eyes went wide with alarm, and she said that Maya must forget him immediately, that nothing good could ever come from thinking about an Apache, that their peoples had been enemies since before their grandmothers were born, but Maya could not forget no matter how hard she tried. Fate works in mysterious ways, and on a warm evening when the sky was turning purple and gold with sunset, both Daniel and Maya found themselves walking alone to the same bend in the river, each seeking solitude and each carrying thoughts of the other. And when Daniel came around a stand of cottonwood trees and saw her standing there at the water's edge, his heart stopped and then started again beating twice as fast, and Maya turned at the sound of his footsteps and froze like a deer that has just sensed the hunter. And for a long moment they simply stood there, 20 paces apart, the evening air thick with possibility and danger. Daniel slowly raised his hands to show he carried no weapons, and he said in the trade language that many tribes used for commerce, "I will not hurt you." And his voice came out rougher than he intended because his throat was tight with emotion, and Maya's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest, but something about his voice, deep and sincere and gentle, made her believe him, and she replied in the same trade tongue, "You spared my father. Why?" And it was not really a question, but more of a wonder. He took a step closer, moving slowly and carefully, and said, "When I looked at you that day, all the hatred I had been taught just disappeared, and I saw only a person. I saw only you." And Maya felt tears prick at her eyes because she had felt the same thing. That sudden recognition that went beyond tribe and tradition, and she took a step toward him too, and then another. And soon they were standing close enough to speak in normal voices, close enough to see the details of each other's faces. And Daniel thought she was even more beautiful up close, and Maya thought he looked kind despite the warrior paint he had worn during the raid. They talked as the sun sank lower and the first stars appeared, speaking in the trade language with its limited vocabulary, but somehow managing to communicate things that went far deeper than words. And Daniel learned that her name was Maya, and that her mother had died bringing her into the world, and that her father had raised her alone, teaching her to be strong and independent. And Maya learned that Daniel had lost his uncle to a Comanche raid, and that he had come seeking revenge but had found something else instead, something that confused and frightened and excited him all at once. Maya told him that her father had taught her to judge people by their actions rather than by what tribe they belonged to, and that Daniel's action in sparing him had shown more courage than killing him would have. And Daniel told her about his dreams of a world where Apache and Comanche did not have to be enemies, where the endless cycle of revenge could finally be broken. And as they talked, the moon rose full and bright, turning the river to liquid silver. And neither of them wanted to leave, but both knew they must before someone came looking for them. Before they parted, Maya asked if he would come back tomorrow, and Daniel's answer was immediate and certain. Yes, at sunset. Here. And they met the next evening and the next and the next, each meeting a risk that could get them both killed or worse, but also each meeting a revelation that drew them closer together. And Daniel taught Maya some Apache words, and Maya taught Daniel Comanche phrases. And they shared stories of their childhoods and their hopes and their fears, finding that they had more in common than either had imagined possible. Daniel showed Maya how Apache trackers read the land, how a bent blade of grass or a scuff mark in the dirt could tell a whole story, and Maya taught Daniel the Comanche way of singing to horses, melodies that seemed to speak to something deep in the animals' souls, and slowly, carefully, with the inevitability of water flowing downhill, they fell in love, not despite their different tribes but in some way because of them, because their love felt like an act of rebellion against all the hatred and violence that had defined their people's relationship. But secrets are hard to keep, especially secrets of the heart, and Sophie noticed that Maya disappeared every evening at the same time and returned with grass stains on her dress and a distant smile on her face. And Carlos noticed that Daniel's evening scouting trips always took him to the same stretch of river, and that he came back looking both happier and more troubled than before. And both friends began to suspect the truth, and both worried about what would happen when that truth came into the light. 6 weeks into their secret meetings, Carlos followed Daniel one evening and watched from hiding as his friend met with a Comanche girl, watched them embrace and talk and laugh together like they had known each other for years instead of weeks. And when Carlos confronted Daniel the next morning, his face was tight with anger and fear, demanding to know if Daniel had lost his mind, meeting with the enemy, falling for a Comanche woman, betraying everything their people stood for. Daniel met his friend's anger with calm certainty, saying, "Her name is Maya, and she is not my enemy. She never was." And Carlos said that the tribal council would have to know that keeping this secret made him a traitor too. But Daniel grabbed his arm and begged him to wait, to give him time, to trust him as a brother. And Carlos was torn between duty and friendship, between the traditions he had been raised with and the evidence of his own eyes that Daniel had never looked happier or more at peace. Sophie had discovered Maya's secret too, and when she told Joseph Redfeather that his daughter was acting strangely and disappearing every evening, the old warrior's suspicions were immediately aroused, and when he confronted Maya that night and demanded the truth, she could not lie to him, telling him everything about Daniel and their meetings and the love that had grown between them. And Joseph's face went through a transformation of emotions, from shock to fury to something that looked almost like grief, and he said that Maya had dishonored him and their tribe in the memory of her dead mother. Maya fought back with words that were both respectful and fierce, saying that Daniel had saved Joseph's life, and that he was good and kind, and that if their peoples wanted peace instead of endless war, someone had to be brave enough to build the first bridge. And Joseph told her she would never see the Apache warrior again, that tomorrow they would move camp far to the north, and that if he ever encountered Daniel, he would kill him without hesitation. And Maya's world seemed to crack apart because she could not imagine going back to a life without Daniel in it, could not imagine returning to the old hatreds after tasting the sweetness of love. The afternoon hours crawled by like wounded animals as the tribal elders met in separate councils, debating the fate of two young people who had dared to love across enemy lines. And Daniel sat with Carlos and a few other Apache warriors who had become sympathetic to his cause, while Maya waited with Sophie and Ruth standing elk, both women offering what comfort they could, and the tension in the gathering ground was so thick it seemed the air itself might crack and shatter. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, the councils reassembled, and Daniel and Maya were brought to stand in the center of the great circle, separated by 10 paces but close enough to draw strength from each other's presence, and every eye in the gathering was fixed on them, some looks holding anger, others curiosity, a few showing something that might have been hope. Vincent Gray Wolf spoke first, his weathered face grave and his voice heavy with the weight of leadership, and he said, "The Apache elders have debated long and hard about what Daniel Blackhawk has done, meeting in secret with a Comanche, giving his heart to our traditional enemy, and opinions are divided. Some call for his banishment, others see in his actions a courage that deserves recognition." And he paused, looking around the circle before continuing, "We are a people who value bravery above almost all else, and it takes great bravery to stand before your tribe and speak an unpopular truth." Samuel Brokenlance stood next, his face like carved stone, and he said, "The Comanche elders have no such division. This girl has shamed her family and her people. She will be sent to live with our northern cousins far from Apache lands, and she is forbidden from ever seeing this warrior again." And Maya's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water, but she kept her head high and her eyes dry. Before anyone else could speak, Ruth Standing Elk rose to her feet, and the old healer commanded respect even from those who disagreed with her, and she said, "Samuel Brokenlance speaks as if he represents all Comanche, but he does not speak for me in the old ways. Before anger hardened our hearts, women had voices in council matters, and I say we should hear what this girl has to say." A Kiowa chief named Peter Talkingbird, a man known for his wisdom and fairness, stood and added his voice, saying, "Let her speak. The Kiowa have no stake in Apache and Comanche blood feuds, but we are interested in hearing wisdom wherever it comes from, and sometimes the young see clearly what the old have forgotten." Samuel looked ready to object, but the murmur of agreement from other neutral tribes in the gathering convinced him to sit down, and Maya stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she spoke, and she said, "I have heard the stories of our people's conflicts since I was small. Every raid creates orphans. Every revenge births new hatred. My mother died young and my father raised me alone, teaching me to be strong and to think for myself. And when Daniel spared my father's life, he broke the cycle." She looked around the circle, meeting eyes with as many people as she could, and continued, "Daniel chose mercy over revenge even though his uncle had died in a Comanche raid, and that choice took more strength than any killing would have. We do not claim our love will erase generations of conflict, but perhaps it can be a beginning. Perhaps the children we might have could belong to both peoples, could be a living bridge." Daniel spoke then, his voice ringing clear across the gathering, saying, "My chief, my elders, my brothers and sisters, I know I have broken trust. I know I have walked a dangerous path, but I ask you to see what I have seen. Our enemy has a human face, their hearts beat like ours. Their love for family and freedom matches our own." And Carlos Running Bear surprised everyone by standing up and saying, "I have known Daniel since we were boys. He is the most honest warrior I have ever fought beside, and perhaps he is right. Perhaps it is time to ask if the old hatreds serve us anymore." The debate raged for hours as the sun sank lower, and the cooking fires were lit, with warriors from both tribes standing to speak either for or against the proposal, and some stories were told of loved ones lost to the other tribe's raids, stories filled with pain and anger that seemed to justify the continuation of hostility. But other voices spoke of weariness, of children growing up without fathers, of women left alone, of a way of life that seemed to produce nothing but grief. Then Joseph Redfeather stood, and the gathering fell silent because everyone knew that his words would carry enormous weight, and his face was torn with conflicting emotions as he began to speak, saying, "When my wife died giving birth to Maya, I wanted to die too. But I held my daughter and I made a promise to raise her with strength and integrity, to teach her to think and not just to obey." And his voice broke slightly as he continued, "I have watched her grow into a woman of courage and wisdom, and now she asks me to see with new eyes." He paused, and everyone waited to hear what he would say next. And finally he spoke again, saying, "I cannot say I approve of what she has done. The Apache have caused my people great pain. But this young warrior spared my life when he could have taken it. He showed mercy to an enemy. And is that not what we claim to value? Is honor not measured by how we treat those we have power over?" And he walked slowly to the center of the circle, standing between his daughter and the Apache warrior. "If my daughter believes this man is worthy," Joseph said, his voice growing stronger, "if she is willing to stake her future on him, then perhaps I should trust the wisdom I tried to teach her." And Samuel Broken Lance looked betrayed, saying, "Brother of my sister, you would allow this disgrace." And Joseph turned to face him, saying, "I would allow my daughter to choose her own path, as her mother would have wanted, as the old ways, before they were poisoned by endless warfare, would have permitted." Vincent Grey Wolf stood again, and he said, "Joseph Redfeather's words carry weight. Perhaps we old chiefs need to hear the voices of the young, who will inherit the world we leave behind." And he looked around the circle thoughtfully before continuing, "I propose a trial. Let Daniel Blackhawk and Maya Redfeather be married if that is their wish. Let them live between our peoples belonging to both. And for 1 full year let us see if this bridge they speak of can truly stand." The gathering erupted in discussion, with Samuel arguing fiercely against the proposal. But other voices rose in support, and the Kiowa chief called it a wise compromise, and Ruth Standing Elk praised the decision, and even some traditional Apache warriors, moved by Carlos's support and Joseph's sacrifice, agreed to give the idea a chance. And as the moon rose high overhead, Vincent called for the chiefs of each tribe to vote on the proposal. The voting took time, with each chief consulting quietly with their advisors, and Daniel and Maya stood together now, their hands finally touching, drawing strength from each other as they waited to hear their fate. And when Vincent finally announced that the vote had passed, that they would be permitted to marry under the conditions he had outlined, Maya felt her knees go weak with relief, and Daniel caught her, holding her up, both of them crying now, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of having their love recognized, even if only conditionally. Not everyone was happy with the decision. Samuel Broken Lance left the gathering in fury, taking a small group of traditionalist warriors with him, and his parting words were bitter, saying, "This will end in blood and betrayal, as all dealings with the Apache do." But others, even those who had doubts, agreed to honor the chief's decision and to see what would come of this unprecedented experiment. The wedding was planned for 3 days hence, giving time for preparations and for tempers to cool somewhat, and it would be a ceremony unlike any that had been performed before, combining elements of both Apache and Comanche traditions, officiated by Ruth Standing Elk and an Apache holy man named George Longrider. And Maya would wear a dress that blended the beadwork patterns of both peoples, and Daniel would carry weapons made by craftsmen from both tribes. As the gathering settled down for the night, Daniel and Maya finally had a moment alone, walking to a quiet spot away from the camps, and they held each other under the stars, hardly able to believe that they had survived the day, that they had spoken their truth and lived to tell about it. And Maya said, "We did it, we actually did it." And Daniel replied, "We did it together, and together we will make this work, no matter how hard it gets." And they knew that the hard part was really just beginning, that proving their love could serve as a bridge would take everything they had. But they also knew that they were ready to try. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and warm sun, as if the heavens themselves approved of what was happening, and people from both tribes gathered at the spot where 3 rivers met. The neutral ground now transformed into a sacred space where something entirely new was being born, and Maya wore her dress of blended beadwork, patterns from her mother's people intertwined with designs from Daniel's tribe, creating something beautiful that belonged to both traditions and to neither. Daniel stood waiting for her, dressed in his finest warrior attire but carrying the Comanche-made lance that Joseph had crafted specifically for this occasion, a gift that spoke louder than any words of his acceptance. And when Maya walked toward him, accompanied by Ruth Standing Elk on one side and Sophie on the other, Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat because she looked like something from a dream, beautiful and brave and entirely his. Ruth Standing Elk and George Longrider conducted the ceremony together, their voices blending Apache and Comanche words into prayers that asked the spirits of both peoples to bless this union. And when it came time for vows, Daniel spoke first, saying, I promise to honor both our peoples, to work every day to prove that love can be stronger than hatred, to build a bridge that others can cross safely. And his voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Maya's vows came from her heart, saying, I promise to be brave when the path is difficult, to remember that we build not just for ourselves but for those who will come after, to show that two peoples can become one family without either losing what makes them who they are. And as she spoke, tears ran down Joseph's weathered face, and even some of the Apache warriors, who had opposed the marriage, found themselves moved by the sincerity and courage of these two young people. When the ceremony concluded and Daniel and Maya were declared husband and wife, the gathering erupted in cheers that were louder than expected, because even those who had doubts could not help but be affected by the hope and possibility of the moment, and the celebration that followed included food and dancing from both traditions, with Apache drums answering Comanche songs, and children from both tribes playing together as if they had always been friends. Their new home had been built in advance by volunteers from both peoples, a dwelling that stood at the exact spot where Daniel and Maya had first met secretly, and it was simple but sturdy, made of materials gathered from both Apache and Comanche lands, another symbol of the blending they represented. And as the sun set on their wedding day, they walked together to this home hand in hand, ready to begin the real work of proving their love could change the world. The first months of their marriage were challenging in ways they had not fully anticipated, because they were learning not just to live together as husband and wife, but also to navigate the constant stream of visitors and messengers and traders who came to test this new arrangement, and some came with genuine curiosity, wanting to see if this bridge between peoples could really work, while others came looking for weakness, hoping to prove the experiment a failure so things could go back to the familiar patterns of hostility. Carlos visited frequently, bringing news from the Apache camps and helping Daniel establish hunting patterns in the new territory. And slowly, grudgingly, he developed a respect for Maya, seeing how hard she worked to make the bridge real, and one day he told her, "You make my brother happy. That counts for something, but you also make him vulnerable. Both our peoples have those who would love to see this fail." And Maya met his eyes and said, "I know, which is why we cannot fail." Sophie came often as well, bringing gifts and gossip from the Comanche camps, and her friendship with Maya had survived the scandal, though it had cost her some standing among the more traditional families. And she told Maya, "They call me a traitor lover for supporting you, but I remember what you said about cycles of hatred. My grandmother lost 3 sons to Apache raids. When does the mourning end? When do we decide we have lost enough?" And the two friends would sit together weaving baskets or preparing food, talking about hopes for a future different from the past. The real work of the bridge came in facilitating trade and communication between the tribes. When a Comanche family needed medicine that only Apache healers knew how to prepare, Maya and Daniel arranged the exchange, and when Apache hunters wanted to trade for the superior horses the Comanche bred, they made it possible, and slowly, cautiously, people from both tribes began to see the practical benefits of cooperation, began to understand that the bridge was not just symbolic but actually useful. Winter came hard and fast that year, bringing storms that buried the land under snow and ice. And it was during one of these storms that Daniel and Maya faced their first real test, when a group of Apache children out practicing their hunting skills became lost in a blizzard, and Maya organized a search party that included warriors from both tribes, something that would have been unthinkable just months before. Carlos led one search team, and a Comanche warrior named Frank Swiftwater led another, and these two men who would have killed each other on sight not long ago now worked together with a single purpose: to find the missing children before the cold claimed them. And when Frank's team discovered the children huddled in a cave nearly frozen, it was Carlos who had the medicine needed to treat their exposure, and the two warriors worked side by side through the night to save young lives. That rescue became a turning point in the bridge-building effort, because the families of those saved children could not maintain hatred toward people who had helped save their sons and daughters, and word of the cooperation spread through both camps, changing minds and softening hearts, and the children themselves would grow up with a different story than their parents had known, a story of warriors from different peoples working together instead of against each other. As spring approached and the snow melted to reveal new grass, Maya discovered she was pregnant, and the news spread quickly through both communities like wildfire, creating reactions that ranged from joy to anxiety. because this child would be the firstborn of both Apache and Comanche blood, a living embodiment of what Daniel and Maya had been trying to build. And the baby's existence would make the bridge undeniably real in a way that even the most skeptical could not ignore. Joseph came to visit when he heard the news, and he held his daughter's hands with tears in his eyes, saying, "Your mother would be so proud of you. You have more courage than I ever did." And then he turned to Daniel and said, "Take care of her and take care of my grandchild, and know that you have earned my respect, even if I still sometimes struggle to understand how all of this happened." And Daniel clasped his father-in-law's arm in the warrior's grip and promised to protect Maya and their baby with his life. Vincent Gray Wolf also came bearing gifts and blessings, bringing a cradle board carved by the finest Apache craftsmen, and he told them, "Your year is not yet complete, but already you have achieved more than I dared hope. You have shown that cooperation benefits everyone, and that is no small thing." And he looked at Maya's growing belly with something like wonder, saying, "This child will belong to both peoples, will carry the hopes of both in their blood." But not everyone celebrated the pregnancy. Samuel Broken Lance sent word through intermediaries that he considered the child an abomination, and rumors reached Daniel and Maya that Samuel was gathering warriors in his northern camp, planning something, though what exactly remained unclear, and the shadow of this opposition hung over their happiness like a cloud that refused to move. Maya's belly grew round with life as summer returned to the land, bringing warmth and plenty, and she and Daniel would sit together in the evenings, his hand on her stomach feeling their child move and kick, and they would talk about what kind of world they wanted to bring this baby into, what stories they would tell about how Apache and Comanche learned to be family instead of enemies. And Daniel would say, "Our child will know both languages, both ways, both peoples," and Maya would reply, "Our child will know that love built this bridge and love will keep it standing." That night, Maya slipped out of her father's lodge, knowing it might be the last time she would see Daniel. Knowing that her world was about to be torn apart by forces beyond her control, and she ran through the darkness to their meeting place by the river, her heart pounding with fear and desperation. And when she arrived, Daniel was already there. And from the expression on his face, she knew that he too had been discovered, that Carlos had given him an ultimatum just as her father had given her one. And they fell into each other's arms with the knowledge that time was running out. Daniel told her that Carlos had agreed to keep silent for 3 days, giving Daniel time to figure out what to do, and Maya told him that her father planned to move the Comanche camp north tomorrow, putting miles of dangerous territory between them, and they stood there in the moonlight trying to find a solution that did not exist, trying to see a path forward through a wall of tradition and tribal hatred that seemed too thick to break. "Run away with me," Daniel said with desperate urgency. "We can go west beyond both our people's lands. We can start a new life where no one knows us and no one cares about Apache or Comanche." And for a moment, Maya was tempted because the thought of being free with Daniel, of building a life together without the weight of their tribe's expectations, seemed like paradise, but then she shook her head and said, "If we run, we solve nothing, we just hide. And our peoples continue the same cycle of hatred and revenge, and we live the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, never really free." They talked through the night, considering and rejecting plan after plan, each option seeming worse than the last, and as the sky began to lighten in the east, they came to a decision that terrified them both, but also felt right in a way that hiding or running never could, and they decided to reveal their love openly at the traditional gathering that was scheduled for 3 weeks from now, when Apache and Comanche and other tribes would meet at the neutral ground to trade and negotiate, and they would stand before both peoples and speak their truth and hope that someone, somewhere would listen with an open heart. It was a dangerous plan, possibly suicidal, because there was every chance that both tribes would reject them, that they would be punished or killed or banished. But it was also honest, and if they had any hope of building a bridge between their peoples, it had to be built on truth rather than deception. And as they kissed goodbye in the growing light of dawn, both knowing it might be weeks before they saw each other again, they made a promise to each other that no matter what happened at the gathering, they would face it together. Daniel returned to his camp and told Carlos what they had decided, and his friend looked at him like he had announced plans to fly to the moon, saying, "You are going to stand before both tribes and declare your love for a Comanche girl. Do you understand that they might kill you both on the spot?" And Daniel said yes, he understood, But he also understood that some things were worth dying for, and maybe, just maybe, there were enough people tired of the old hatreds that they would be willing to try something new. Maya told her father that she would go north with the Comanche, but that he could not stop her from speaking her truth at the gathering, and Joseph looked at his daughter with a mixture of anger and sorrow, and something that might have been pride, because she was showing the kind of courage he had always taught her to value, even if she was using it in a way he could not approve, and he said nothing, just turned away, and Maya knew that the silence between them would be long and painful. The 3 weeks before the gathering passed slowly, each day heavy with anticipation and dread, and Daniel threw himself into preparations, speaking quietly with a few trusted warriors about his plans, finding that opinions were more divided than he had expected, with some calling him a traitor and others admitting that they were tired of the endless warfare, that maybe it was time to try a different path. And Carlos, despite his doubts, stood by his friend, saying that even if Daniel was crazy, he was brave, and that counted for something. Maya faced similar mixed reactions among the Comanche, with Sophie supporting her despite her fears, and a few of the older women, especially a healer named Ruth Standing Elk, saying that in the old days, before hatred had hardened everyone's hearts, such marriages between tribes were not uncommon, that maybe the young people were remembering something the old ones had forgotten, and Ruth promised to speak on Maya's behalf at the gathering, which gave Maya a small spark of hope in the darkness. The gathering ground was a wide valley where 3 rivers met, a place that had been neutral territory for as long as anyone could remember, and when the Apache arrived from the south and the Comanche from the north, along with Kiowa and Cheyenne and other tribes, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Daniel and Maya saw each other across the distance that separated their camps, but they did not approach, saving their moment for the formal council that would begin tomorrow. That night neither of them slept, both lying awake in their respective camps thinking about what they would say, how they would stand before their peoples and speak words that could not be taken back, and Daniel wondered if his courage would fail him when the moment came, and Maya wondered if anyone would listen, or if they would simply be shouted down by voices that preferred the familiar comfort of old hatreds to the uncertain risk of something new. The council began at midday, with the chiefs and elders of each tribe sitting in a great circle, and warriors and families gathered around them to listen and witness. And the business of the gathering proceeded as it always did, with discussions of hunting territories and trade agreements and complaints about past violations, and Daniel sat among the Apache warriors, his heart beating so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. And across the circle Maya sat among the Comanche women, her hands clenched in her lap, her face pale but determined. When there was a pause in the proceedings, Daniel stood up and all eyes turned to him, and he said in a voice that started shaky but grew stronger, "Honored chiefs and elders, I ask permission to speak of a matter that concerns both Apache and Comanche." And Vincent Gray Wolf, the Apache chief, nodded and said, "Speak, Daniel Blackhawk. You have earned the right to be heard." And Daniel took a deep breath and began. He spoke about the cycle of revenge that had defined their people's relationship for generations, about how each raid led to a counter-raid, each death to another death, and how nobody could even remember anymore who had started the conflict or why it continued. And he asked a simple question. What if there was another way? And before anyone could respond, Maya stood up, and her father tried to pull her down, but she shook him off. And she said in a clear voice, "I am Maya Redfeather, and I stand with Daniel's words." The gathering erupted in shocked murmurs and angry shouts, and Samuel Broken Lance, Maya's uncle, and one of the hardest Comanche warriors, demanded to know what this meant, and Daniel and Maya looked at each other across the circle, drawing strength from each other's eyes, and Daniel said, "Maya and I have been meeting in secret for many weeks. We have learned each other's languages and shared our stories, and we have fallen in love." The noise of the crowd grew louder, some voices calling for violence, others demanding separation, and Samuel's face went purple with rage as he shouted, "This is an abomination. My niece has been corrupted by Apache lies." But Maya's voice cut through the chaos, saying, "I have been corrupted by nothing except the truth. Daniel showed mercy when he could have killed my father. He chose understanding over hatred, and if we want our children to live in peace, someone must be first to lay down the old grudges." Joseph Redfeather stood slowly, his face a mask of pain, and he said, "Daughter, you break my heart." How can I face our people knowing you have betrayed everything we hold sacred?" And Maya's tears flowed freely now as she said, "I betray nothing, Father. I honor the strength you taught me. You always said to judge people by their actions, not by their birth, and Daniel's actions have been honorable." Vincent Grey Wolf raised his hand for silence, and gradually the shouting died down, and the old chief said, "This is unprecedented. I must consult with my elders." And he looked at Samuel and said, "I suggest you do the same. We will meet again at sunset." And the gathering broke up into arguing groups, with Daniel and Maya kept separate by their respective peoples, but their eyes met across the distance, holding on to each other with looks that said everything words could not. The attack came on a hot summer morning when the air shimmered with heat and grasshoppers sang in the tall grass. And Daniel had gone hunting with Carlos, leaving Maya at home, though she was now 7 months pregnant and moved slowly, her belly heavy with the child who would soon enter the world, and they had barely been gone an hour when they saw smoke rising from the direction of their home, black and threatening against the blue sky, and without a word they abandoned their hunt and rode back faster than Daniel had ever ridden, fear driving them like a whip. Samuel Broken Lance had come with 20 warriors, a mix of Comanche loyalists who still clung to the old hatreds and some renegade Apache who opposed Vincent's peace efforts, and they had surrounded the home that Daniel and Maya had built, demanding that Maya return to her people, and that Daniel be punished for what they called corrupting her and poisoning the natural order of things. And when Daniel and Carlos arrived, they found Maya standing in the doorway with a rifle in her hands, her pregnant belly prominent, facing down her uncle with a courage that made Daniel's heart swell with pride and terror. Several friends from both tribes had already gathered to help defend the home, forming a ragged line between Samuel's warriors and the dwelling, but they were badly outnumbered, maybe 10 defenders against 20 attackers, and the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip into violence at any moment. And Samuel was shouting, "Stand aside, niece. This madness ends today. Come home with dignity or be taken by force." Maya's voice rang clear despite her fear, saying, "This is my home, these are my people, both Apache and Comanche. You have no authority here." And her hands were steady on the rifle, even though Daniel could see from the tightness around her eyes that she was frightened. And he loved her more in that moment than ever before, seeing her stand strong in defense of everything they had built together. Daniel dismounted and walked slowly toward the confrontation, Carlos at his side, and he said in a voice that carried across the tense space, "Samuel Broken Lance, I know you believe you fight for honor, but what honor is there in threatening a pregnant woman, in attacking those who have harmed no one, who have only tried to build something better than the endless cycle of revenge?" And Samuel's face twisted with rage as he shouted back, "You have harmed everything. You poison our people with false promises of peace." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed right there, with Samuel's warriors preparing to charge and the defenders bracing for impact. But then riders appeared from 2 directions at once, and Joseph Redfeather came from one side with a group of Comanche warriors loyal to the peace effort. And from the other direction, Vincent Grey Wolf rode in with Apache fighters, and both groups positioned themselves between Samuel's force and the home, creating a wall of bodies that Samuel would have to go through to reach Maya and Daniel. Joseph addressed his brother-in-law directly, his voice heavy with disappointment, saying, "Samuel, I understand your anger because I shared it once, but I have watched my daughter build something remarkable here. I have seen warriors from our tribes work together and trade together and save each other's children. Would you destroy all of that to satisfy your pride?" And Samuel shouted back, "This is not about pride, this is about survival. The Apache will betray us as they always have." Vincent Grey Wolf spoke then, his old voice carrying the authority of years and wisdom, saying, "Samuel Broken Lance, you speak of betrayal, but who betrays their own people now? You attack those who have broken no law and violated no treaty. You threaten a woman carrying new life. Is this the Comanche honor you claim to defend?" And his words hit hard because everyone there knew he spoke truth, and a murmur of uncertainty ran through Samuel's warriors. Frank Swiftwater, the Comanche warrior who had worked with Carlos to save the lost Apache children, stepped forward from Samuel's group, and he said in a voice that shook with emotion, "I came here believing we would be rescuing Maya from deception, but I see no deception. I see people who have chosen a different path, and they have the support of both chiefs. Samuel, I cannot fight against this." And he lowered his weapon and walked across the space to stand with Joseph's group. Others followed Frank's lead, One by one, warriors who had come expecting to find corruption but instead saw community, people from both tribes standing together in defense of a shared ideal, and Samuel watched his force crumble as more than half his warriors abandoned him, leaving him with less than 10 men who still believed in the old hatred strongly enough to fight for them. Cornered and outnumbered, Samuel faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could attack and almost certainly die in a futile battle that would accomplish nothing, or he could retreat and live to oppose the peace another day. And his hand trembled on his weapon as rage and calculation warred in his face, and for a long moment the outcome hung uncertain. Maya called out to him, her voice softer now, saying, "Uncle, I do not want to be your enemy. I want you to meet your great niece or nephew when they are born. I want you to see what we are building here. Please give peace a chance." And for just a second something softened in Samuel's hard eyes, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. But then the hardness returned and he said in a voice like stones grinding together, "You are lost to me, all of you are lost." He turned his horse and rode away without another word, his remaining loyalists following, and the gathered warriors watched them go until they disappeared over the hills to the north, and only then did everyone relax, the tension draining away like water into sand. And Daniel ran to Maya and took her in his arms, careful of her belly, and she dropped the rifle and held him and cried against his shoulder. The fear she had been holding back finally released. That evening, as various groups made camp around the home because no one wanted to leave until they were certain Samuel would not return, Daniel and Maya stood together watching the sunset, and her hand rested on her swollen belly where their child moved and kicked. And Daniel said, "We almost lost everything today." But Maya shook her head and replied, "We did not lose it, and more people stood with us than against us. That has to mean something. That has to count for the future." Ruth Standing Elk approached them as the stars began to appear, the old healer who had supported their union from the very beginning, and she looked at Maya's belly with experienced eyes and said, "The baby comes soon, maybe 3 weeks, perhaps less. I will stay if you permit it to help with the birth and to make sure no more trouble comes." And Maya hugged the old woman gratefully, saying, "We would be honored to have you here." George Longrider, the Apache holy man, also offered to stay, saying, "This child carries the hopes of many people. We should greet them with all the blessings both our peoples can offer." And so the community grew around Daniel and Maya's home, people from both tribes camping nearby, creating a protective circle that was also a statement of solidarity, a physical manifestation of the bridge that had been built. As the days passed and Maya's time grew closer, Daniel realized something important, that what they had built was stronger than he had dared believe. It was not perfect and it still faced challenges and opposition, but it was real. It had survived its first serious test, and people had risked their lives not just to defend Daniel and Maya, but to defend the idea of what they represented, the possibility of a world where old enemies could become new family. 3 weeks later, just as Ruth had predicted, Maya went into labor as the sun was setting, and the birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, and both Ruth and George attended along with several women from both tribes who had come to support Maya, and Daniel waited outside with Carlos and Joseph and the other men, pacing and praying and trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. When the baby finally arrived with the dawn, her cry rang out strong and clear, a sound that seemed to announce to the world that something new had been born, and Ruth came out to tell the waiting men, "A daughter, healthy and perfect. Come meet her." And Daniel rushed inside to find Maya exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, and when he looked down at his daughter's face, his tears fell freely because she was beautiful beyond words, with her mother's eyes and features that blended both peoples into something entirely unique and precious beyond measure. They named their daughter Christina Morningstar, a name that belonged to neither Apache nor Comanche tradition alone, but somehow to both. Christina because she represented the dawn of something new, and Morningstar because she was the light that appeared before the sunrise, the promise of hope before the full day arrived. And when word of the birth spread through both tribes, people came from near and far to see this child who carried the blood of old enemies in her tiny veins, and they brought gifts and blessings and songs from both peoples. Daniel held his daughter with hands that trembled with the enormity of what she represented, whispering to her, "Welcome to the world, little one. You are loved by so many already. You will grow up knowing both your peoples, learning both languages, walking in both worlds. And Christina looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. And she made small noises that might have been agreement or might have just been baby sounds, but either way they filled his heart with joy. Joseph Redfeather wept openly when he held his granddaughter for the first time. This old warrior who had seen so much death and loss, and he said to Maya, "She has your mother's eyes. Your mother would have loved her so much." And then he looked at Daniel and said, "Take care of them both, they are precious beyond price. And you have given me something I never thought to have, a grandchild who represents hope instead of hatred." Vincent Grey Wolf came to see the baby and declared before all assembled, "This child has brought more joy to our people than any successful raid ever did. Perhaps that tells us something about the path we should choose going forward. Perhaps the old ways of war and revenge have run their course, and it is time to try something different." And his words carried weight because he was speaking not just as a chief but as a grandfather figure to his entire tribe. The months that followed Christina's birth saw the bridge between Apache and Comanche grow, stronger and more practical. Joint hunting parties brought in more game than either tribe could manage alone, because they could cover more territory and share knowledge about where the herds moved. And trade flourished with Apache metalwork and tools exchanged for Comanche horses and leather goods. And healers from both peoples began sharing their knowledge of medicines and treatments, saving lives that might otherwise have been lost. Carlos Running Bear had become one of the strongest advocates for the peace, having seen firsthand how cooperation benefited everyone, and he surprised both tribes by courting Sophie Brightwater, Maya's best friend, and when he asked permission to marry her, following the example that Daniel and Maya had set, the resistance was much less than it had been before, proof that attitudes were changing and the bridge was becoming a road that others could travel. Their wedding ceremony was smaller than Daniel and Maya's, but no less meaningful. Another joining of Apache and Comanche, another strand woven into the growing connection between the peoples. And Carlos told Daniel, "You were right, brother. Love is stronger than hate, but it takes work. Every single day it takes constant effort and choosing again and again to build instead of destroy." Christina's first birthday approached as the seasons turned and the year-long trial period that Vincent and the other chiefs had set came to its end, and a grand council was called to evaluate whether the experiment had succeeded well enough to continue and expand or whether it should be considered a noble failure, and both peoples should return to their separate ways. And Daniel and Maya traveled to the gathering ground with their daughter, knowing that the decision made there would shape not just their lives, but the lives of generations yet unborn. The gathering was even larger than the one where Daniel and Maya had first revealed their love, with representatives from Apache and Comanche and also Kiowa and Cheyenne and other tribes who had watched the developments with great interest, wondering if what had happened between these two peoples might be possible for others as well. And the council began with Vincent Grey Wolf asking the question that everyone had come to answer. Has this bridge between our peoples proven strong enough to continue and grow? Testimonies came from all sides, with people standing to share their experiences of the past year, and a widow spoke of how Comanche warriors had helped her family survive a harsh winter when her husband had died, bringing food and firewood and asking nothing in return. And a trader described the prosperity that open commerce had brought to both peoples, goods flowing freely that had once been obtained only through raids, and a hunter told of teaching his skills to young men from both tribes and watching them become brothers in spirit if not in blood. Not all voices spoke in favor of continuing. Some expressed concern that traditional ways were being lost and diluted, that the unique character of each people was being compromised, and others worried that the peace made them vulnerable to other enemies who might see cooperation as weakness. And a few still harbored deep resentment for past losses that no amount of present cooperation could erase. But when the time came for the chiefs to decide, the vote was overwhelmingly clear. The experiment would not only continue but would be formalized into a lasting peace treaty, not just a temporary truce but a genuine alliance between Apache and Comanche that would establish shared hunting grounds and rules for trade and protocols for resolving disputes and most importantly protections for families like Daniel and Maya's who existed between both worlds. The treaty negotiations took many days, with elders from both sides working through details and arguing about specifics and compromising on points that mattered. And the final document was complex and nuanced, reflecting the reality that combining two peoples was not simple or easy, but required constant attention and adjustment. And when it was finally complete, Both chiefs prepared to sign it at a ceremony that would mark a turning point in their people's history. The signing took place at the exact spot where Daniel and Maya had first met secretly by the river. The place that had once been forbidden ground, now transformed into sacred space where enemies had become family. And as Vincent Grey Wolf and the Comanche chief made their marks on the treaty, Christina woke from her nap and began to cry, and the assembled crowd laughed because it seemed the baby was commenting on the proceedings, and Maya nursed her daughter openly before the gathered tribes, a simple act that spoke volumes about how much had changed. Peter Talkingbird, the Kiowa chief who had supported the peace from its earliest days, stood to speak, and he said, "What we witness here today will be remembered for generations to come. Two peoples who were bitter enemies have chosen a different path, not because it was easy or comfortable, but because two young people had the courage to love across a divide that everyone said could not be crossed, and their daughter will grow up in a world we could only dream of, and she will have children who may not even understand why Apache and Comanche were ever enemies." The celebration that followed lasted for 3 full days, with feasting and dancing and games and storytelling, and warriors who might have faced each other in battle instead competed in friendly contests of skill, shooting arrows at targets and racing horses and wrestling, and young people from both tribes mixed freely, with some forming friendships and others finding romance, following the path that Daniel and Maya had blazed. On the final evening of the celebration, Daniel and Maya slipped away from the crowds and returned to their river spot, seeking a moment of quiet together, and they sat with Christina between them, watching the water flow endlessly past, and Daniel asked, "Do you ever regret it, all the pain we went through, the danger and uncertainty and fear?" And Maya considered the question seriously before shaking her head and saying, "How can I regret the path that led to this?" She gestured to their daughter, to the sounds of celebration in the distance, to the peace they could feel settling over the land like a blanket, and she said, "We did not change everything. Samuel still hates what we represent, and there will be others who resist, but we proved it is possible. We showed that love can win if people are brave enough to choose it." And Daniel pulled out a small carved horse he had been working on, a toy for Christina made from cottonwood, and he said, "When she is old enough, we will tell her the story of how her parents fell in love during a raid, how they met in secret, how they nearly lost everything trying to bring their peoples together." Maya added, "And we will tell her it was worth it. Every hard moment worth it. Every risk justified by what we built." And Christina reached for the carved horse with her small determined hands and laughed, a pure sound of joy that seemed to bless the entire moment and promise that the future would be better than the past, that the bridge they had built would stand and grow stronger, that love given the chance can indeed change the world for the better. The years flowed past like the river that had witnessed the beginning of Daniel and Maya's love, carrying with them changes both small and profound, and Christina grew from a baby into a bright and curious child who spoke both Apache and Comanche with equal fluency, who learned the stories and songs and skills of both peoples, who moved between the two communities with an ease that amazed those who remembered the old days of hatred, and she became a living symbol of what was possible when people chose to build bridges instead of walls. Daniel and Maya's home at the Three Rivers Junction grew into a thriving settlement, a place where people from both tribes and sometimes other nations came to trade and talk and learn from each other. And what had started as one small dwelling became a community of families, some purely Apache, some purely Comanche, and some like Daniel and Maya's mixed and blended, all living together in a harmony that would have seemed impossible just a few years before. Carlos and Sophie had children of their own, 3 sons and a daughter who grew up playing with Christina, and the other mixed heritage children. And these kids knew nothing of the old hatreds except as stories their grandparents told, cautionary tales about a past that seemed as distant and unreal as ancient legends, and they grew up speaking both languages, practicing both traditions, belonging fully to both peoples in a way that created something new and valuable. The practical benefits of the peace became more obvious with each passing season. Joint hunting parties consistently brought in larger harvests because they combined Apache knowledge of the mountain territories with Comanche expertise on the plains, and trade networks expanded beyond just the 2 tribes to include neighboring peoples who saw the prosperity and wanted to participate, and the Three Rivers settlement became a hub of commerce and cultural exchange that enriched everyone involved. But Samuel Broken Lance remained a shadow over the peace, living in his northern camp with a shrinking group of loyalists who still clung to the old ways. and though he never again attempted a direct attack like the one before Christina's birth, his presence served as a reminder that not all wounds heal easily, and not all hearts can be changed by reason or evidence, and Maya sometimes wondered what would finally bring her uncle peace, whether he would die still bitter, or whether something might yet soften his hardened heart. The answer came unexpectedly when Christina was 5 years old, during a particularly harsh winter that brought blizzards and deep cold that threatened everyone's survival, and word reached the Three Rivers settlement that Samuel's northern camp was in desperate trouble. Their food stores had been destroyed by a fire, and several of their hunters had been killed in an encounter with a rival tribe, and they were facing starvation unless help came soon. The council at Three Rivers debated what to do, with some arguing that Samuel had made his choice and must live with the consequences, but Maya stood before them and said, "He is still my uncle, still Comanche, still family, and if we let them starve when we have the means to help, we are no better than the hateful people we used to be." And Daniel supported her, saying, "We prove the bridge is real by extending it even to those who reject it, especially to those who reject it." Vincent Gray Wolf agreed, saying, "Send help. Show Samuel that the peace is not conditional on his approval, that we care for all our people even when they oppose us." And so a relief expedition was organized, with warriors and supplies from both Apache and Comanche contributing, and they traveled north through dangerous winter conditions to bring food and medicine to Samuel's camp. When they arrived, Samuel's pride initially made him want to refuse the help, but his people were truly desperate, and his remaining warriors convinced him to accept. And as he watched Apache and Comanche working together to save his people, something inside him finally began to crack, the armor of hatred that he had worn for so long developing its first real fissure. Joseph Redfeather was part of the relief expedition, and he spoke with his brother-in-law in the privacy of Samuel's lodge, and he said, "You have been wrong about many things, but you were not wrong to fear change. Change is frightening and the loss of the old ways is real. But look at what we have gained. Look at the children who will never know the grief we knew. Is that not worth something?" Samuel did not answer immediately, but later as the relief party prepared to return south, he approached Maya where she was helping distribute supplies, and he looked at her with eyes that held pain and confusion, and the beginnings of understanding, and he said, "I do not know if I can ever fully accept what you have done, but I can see that you did it from love and not from weakness, and that counts for something." And Maya embraced her uncle with tears streaming down her face, knowing it was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Samuel never moved his camp to join the Three Rivers settlement, and he never fully embraced the peace treaty, but he also never again opposed it actively, and in his final years he became a bridge of a different kind, a link to the old ways that helped younger generations understand where they had come from, even as they built something new. And when he died several years later, both Apache and Comanche mourned him and honored him for his courage even when they disagreed with his choices. Christina grew into a remarkable young woman who inherited her mother's strength and her father's wisdom, and she became a skilled diplomat in her own right, traveling to other tribes and helping them negotiate their own peace agreements, using her unique perspective as someone who belonged to two peoples to show others that ancient enemies could become allies, and her work extended the peace far beyond just Apache and Comanche. The Three Rivers settlement grew into a true town, with permanent structures and established trade routes and a reputation as a place where different peoples could meet in safety and friendship, and children like Christina and Carlos and Sophie's kids grew up and had children of their own, creating a generation for whom mixed heritage was completely normal, who could not understand why their grandparents' generation had ever thought tribal identity was more important than human connection. Joseph Redfeather lived long enough to see his great-grandchildren born, descendants who carried his blood and also Apache blood, and the blood of other tribes that had joined the growing community, and in his final days he told Maya, "Your mother would be so proud of what you built. You were braver than I ever was, and you created something that will outlast us all." And he died peacefully, surrounded by family from multiple tribes, a fitting end for a man who had learned to see past the boundaries he had been raised with. As Daniel and Maya grew old together, their hair turning gray and their movements becoming slower, they would often return to that spot by the river where everything had begun, where a forbidden meeting had sparked a transformation that changed their entire world. and they would sit hand in hand watching the water flow endlessly onward, carrying with it the memories of their journey from enemies to lovers to builders of a peace. That had seemed impossible. They told their grandchildren the story of how an Apache warrior had fallen for a Comanche girl during a raid, how they had met in secret and risked everything to build a bridge between their peoples, and the children would listen with wide eyes, grateful for the courage of those who had come before, who had dared to love when the world told them to hate, who had chosen to build instead of destroy. The story that had started with violence and hatred ended with love and hope, proving that sometimes the bravest act is simply choosing to see the humanity in someone you have been taught to fear, and that love, when given the chance and supported by courage and persistence, can indeed change the world in ways both small and profound, creating ripples that spread far beyond the original act and touch lives for generations to come. Christina eventually took over the leadership of the Three Rivers community, and under her guidance it continued to grow and prosper, becoming a model that other communities studied and tried to replicate, and she never forgot to honor her parents' memory by continuing their work, by extending the bridge they had built, by teaching new generations that the walls between peoples are not natural or necessary, but constructed by fear and maintained by habit, and that they can be torn down by anyone brave enough to try. The legacy of Daniel Blackhawk and Maya Redfeather lived on long after they were gone. In the thriving community they had founded, in the descendants who carried their blood and their values, in the peace treaty that bore their influence, and in the simple truth they had proven through their lives, that humanity's shared bonds are stronger than any division, that love is more powerful than hatred, and that the future belongs to those who have the courage to imagine something better than the past and the persistence to make that imagination real. And so the river continued to flow, as it always had and always would, but now it flowed through lands where old enemies had become new family, where children played together without thought of tribal boundaries, where the bridge that two brave young people had built stood strong and wide, inviting all who were willing to cross from the darkness of endless conflict into the light of cooperation and peace, proving that even the deepest hatreds can be overcome when people choose love over fear.